I'm proud of all my children. My father's voice boomed across the crowded backyard. His annual pronouncement at the summer family reunion, a tradition as ingrained as the slightly burnt hot dogs and my Aunt Carol's famously watery potato salad. He paused, his gaze sweeping over my older sister, Charlotte, her husband and their two impeccably behaved children, then my younger brother, Michael, with his new fiancée beaming beside him. His eyes, when they finally landed on me, hardened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression I had become adept at deciphering over 4 decades. All my children, he repeated, his voice taking on a sharper edge, except, of course, the homosexual. The chirping of crickets, the distant laughter from the children's table, even the sizzle of burgers on the grill seemed to cease. A thick, suffocating silence descended upon the 70-odd members of the Finch clan. My name is Julian Finch, 47 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I've been a partner at a leading forensic accounting firm in Chicago. My life is about numbers, about patterns, about the meticulous uncovering of truth hidden beneath layers of deliberate obfuscation. I deal in facts, in evidence, in the cold, hard reality of balance sheets and audit trails. The reality currently unfolding on my Uncle Robert's meticulously manicured lawn, however, was of a far more personal and far more wounding variety. I felt 100 pairs of eyes turned towards me, a mixture of shock, pity, and in some an insidious, barely concealed agreement. My own gaze remained fixed on my father, Arthur Finch Sr., a man whose approval I had long ago ceased to actively seek, but whose public denunciation still landed with the force of a physical blow. He stood there, resplendent in his new golf shirt, his face a mask of righteous conviction, clearly expecting what? For me to crumble? To argue? To burst into tears and beg for his paternal forgiveness? I did none of those things. I simply met his gaze, held it for a long, silent moment, and then, with a calmness that surprised even myself, I placed my paper napkin beside my plate of untouched barbecue chicken, rose from my seat at the trestle table, and began to walk towards the gate. There were no grand pronouncements, no shouted retorts. My departure was as quiet and methodical as the way I conduct a financial investigation. Each step on the soft grass felt deliberate, measured. I could hear a few tentative murmurs behind me, a stifled gasp, perhaps from my mother, but no one called out my name. No one tried to stop me. It was as if my father's words had erected an invisible barrier, a quarantine zone around the son who had dared to deviate from his prescribed path. As I reached the gate, I paused, not to look back, but to retrieve my car keys from my pocket. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful, indifferent backdrop to this ugly little family drama. My father, I knew, had a very specific, very rigid definition of success, of manhood, of what constituted an acceptable life. My life with my partner, David, our shared home in the city, our quiet, fulfilling existence built on mutual respect and a shared love for art and literature, clearly did not fit within those narrow parameters. For years, his disapproval had been a subtle undercurrent, a series of pointed remarks, of conveniently forgotten invitations to certain family events where David might also be present, of a general, pervasive coolness. But this public shaming, this deliberate, cruel excision from the family narrative was a new and far more aggressive escalation. It was a declaration of war of a kind. What Arthur Finch Sr., in his patriarchal arrogance, failed to understand was that a forensic accountant is, by training and temperament, exceptionally well equipped to handle hostility, to navigate complex adversarial situations, and to meticulously dismantle fraudulent claims, whether those claims are found on a balance sheet or in the distorted ledger of a father's expectations. He had just presented me with a significant, unrecorded liability in our familial accounts, and I, Julian Finch, was about to conduct a thorough and ultimately very final audit. The drive back to Chicago was long, the miles unspooling under my tires in the growing darkness. I didn't play any music. The silence in the car was a welcome respite, a space to begin processing, to begin formulating a response. Not an emotional one, not yet. That would come later, in the privacy of my own home, perhaps with David's quiet, unwavering support. No, this was the initial assessment phase, the gathering of preliminary data, the identification of key variables. My father had made a public statement. He had drawn a line. He had, in his own mind, disowned me. But disownment, like bankruptcy, is a complex process, with legal and financial ramifications that extend far beyond a mere verbal declaration at a family barbecue. Arthur Finch Sr., for all his bluster, was a man of considerable, if somewhat ostentatiously displayed, wealth. Wealth that was, in part, built upon a family business that I, in my younger, more naive years, had even briefly worked for, before realizing my temperament was far better suited to the dispassionate analysis of numbers than the glad-handing world of sales he inhabited. There were trusts, there were estate plans, there were joint family holdings. He had just declared one of his primary beneficiaries persona non grata. This would have consequences, not just for me, but for him and for the carefully constructed edifice of the Finch family legacy. He had initiated a hostile demerger. He clearly had no idea of the due diligence that would now be required, or the auditing skills I would bring to the table. He thought he was merely casting out a deviant son. He was, in fact, inviting a full forensic examination of his entire life's work by an expert he himself had, however reluctantly, sired. The game, as they say, was afoot, and this was one audit I was uniquely qualified and now deeply motivated to conduct with unparalleled precision. The first few days after the reunion were a blur of carefully managed emotions and meticulous planning. David, my partner of 12 years, was my rock, his quiet strength a counterpoint to the turmoil that seethed beneath my calm exterior. He didn't offer platitudes or demand immediate retribution on my behalf. He simply listened, provided a safe space for the initial shock to dissipate, and, being a corporate litigator himself, immediately understood the strategic implications of my father's public declaration. This wasn't just an emotional outburst, Julian, he'd said, nursing a glass of wine as we sat in our living room the night I returned. This was a calculated statement. Your father knows the power of public perception, especially within that insulated world he inhabits. He's trying to isolate you, to preemptively discredit you. I nodded, the cold knot in my stomach slowly unclenching as the familiar clarity of strategic thought began to take over. He's also, I suspect, tried to signal a change in his estate planning without having to go through the immediate legal formalities. A public disownment, in his mind, probably feels as binding as a revised will. David had raised an eyebrow at that. Perhaps in his mind. The law, however, tends to require a bit more than a pronouncement over potato salad. Does he have sole discretion over all family assets, or are there trusts, partnerships, pre-existing agreements that involve your mother, or even you and your siblings? This was where my own professional expertise began to intersect with this deeply personal crisis. The Finch family wealth wasn't just Arthur Finch Sr.'s personal piggy bank. It was a complex web of interconnected businesses, real estate holdings, and investment portfolios, many of which had been established by my grandfather, a far more astute and less overtly prejudiced man than his son. My grandfather, a man who had always shown a quiet affection for me, had, I knew, set up several irrevocable trusts for his grandchildren, myself included. The terms were complex, designed to protect the assets from creditors for mismanagement, and, perhaps prophetically, from the capricious whims of future patriarchs. My father was a trustee, yes, but not the sole arbiter. Accessing the details of these trusts, understanding my vested rights, became my immediate priority. I also began to reflect on my history with my father, searching for the precursors to this public immolation. His disapproval had always been there, a low hum beneath the surface of our interactions. When I come out to my parents at 21, my mother, Eleanor, had wept, then hugged me, her love, though tinged with a bewildered sadness, ultimately unconditional. My father, on the other hand, had retreated into a stony silence for weeks. When he finally spoke, it was not to me, but to my mother, loud enough for me to overhear. This is a phase. He'll grow out of it. He needs a strong hand, Eleanor, not your mollycoddling. He'd never directly addressed my sexuality with me again, not until that fateful barbecue. Instead, his disapproval manifested in other ways. The constant, subtle critiques of my career choices, forensic accounting. Sounds dreadfully dull, Julian. Why not something with a bit more dynamism? The pointed comparisons to my more conventionally successful siblings, Charlotte, married to a surgeon, Michael, rapidly climbing the corporate ladder in a tech firm. The way he would always steer conversations away from my personal life, from David, as if acknowledging our relationship would somehow validate it. There were also the financial control tactics, subtle but persistent. Requests for loans for my first apartment had been met with lectures about profligacy, despite my impeccable credit and well-paying job. When I'd started my own small consulting firm before joining my current partnership, he'd offered to invest, but the terms were so predatory, so designed to give him ultimate control, that I'd politely declined, a decision that had clearly irked him. He saw money as power, as a tool for control, and my financial independence, my refusal to be beholden to him, had always been a source of friction. Now, he was attempting the ultimate act of financial and emotional severance. The day after my return to Chicago, I contacted my solicitor, Alastair McPherson, the same meticulous, shrewd lawyer David often collaborated with on complex corporate cases. I laid out the situation, providing him with all the details I could recall about my grandfather's trusts and the general structure of the Finch family holdings. Alastair, a man whose calm demeanor belied a razor-sharp legal mind, listened without interruption. "Julian," he said when I'd finished, "your father's public declaration, while emotionally devastating, has very limited legal standing in terms of disinheritance from irrevocable trusts or previously established beneficiary designations, unless those documents contain specific clauses pertaining to such pronouncements, which is highly unlikely in well-drafted instruments. His actions, however, do indicate a clear intent, and we must assume he will now attempt to formalize this disownment through any legal means available to him." Alastair's immediate advice was to secure copies of all relevant trust documents, a task that might prove challenging if my father, as a trustee, decided to be obstructive. He also suggested a quiet, thorough review of my own financial and legal affairs, ensuring everything was in impeccable order and that David and I had all necessary reciprocal powers of attorney and healthcare directives in place. A stark reminder of the ways in which my father's prejudice sought to invalidate the legitimacy of my most important relationship. The next few days were spent in a flurry of discreet activity. I contacted the law firm that had originally drafted my grandfather's estate plan. Fortunately, they still had records, and as a named beneficiary, I was entitled to copies of the trust agreements pertaining to me. Reading through the dense legalese, a quiet sense of my grandfather's foresight washed over me. The trusts were indeed structured to protect the beneficiaries from precisely this kind of familial capriciousness. My father could manage, he could invest, but he could not unilaterally deny or reallocate my vested interest without breaching his fiduciary duty, an action that would have severe legal consequences. This was a crucial piece of foundational stability. While my father was trying to bulldoze my place in the family, my grandfather had, decades ago, laid down an unshakable bedrock. The emotional fallout, however, was less easily managed. My mother called, her voice choked with tears. "Julian, darling, I am so sorry. Your father, he's impossible sometimes. He won't listen to reason." "It's all right, Mother," I said, though it wasn't. "Are you okay?" I'm trying to talk to him, but he's dug in. He says he's revising his will. He says you've made your choice, and now he's made his. His will is his prerogative, Mother," I replied, keeping my voice even. "My concern is more with the existing family trusts, the ones grandfather established." There was a pause. "Oh, Julian, I don't understand all that legal business. Arthur always handled it." Of course, he did. This was the pattern. My father controlled the information, controlled the narrative, controlled the finances. It was time to introduce some transparency into that opaque system. My sister, Charlotte, also called. Her tone was more ambivalent. "Julian, Dad's really upset. Maybe you could just, I don't know, try to smooth things over? For Mom's sake, smooth things over, Charlotte?" I asked, a hint of steel in my voice. He publicly disowned me for who I love. "What exactly would you suggest I say to smooth that over?" She sighed. "I know it's awful, Julian, but he's our father, and you know how he gets. This will affect everyone. The business, the inheritance," her voice trailed off. The implication was clear. My lifestyle choice was an inconvenience, a potential threat to the family's financial equilibrium. Her loyalty, it seemed, was primarily to the status quo, to the preservation of her own comfortable inheritance. My brother, Michael, was the only one who offered unequivocal support. "What Dad did was despicable, Julian," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Laura and I are with you, 100%. If he tries to cut you out of anything Granddad left us, we'll fight him right alongside you. This isn't just about you, it's about decency." Michael's call was a bomb, a reminder that not all familial bonds were as conditional as my father's love. With Alistair's guidance and the foundational knowledge from my grandfather's trusts, I began to formulate a multi-pronged strategy. It wasn't about revenge. It was about asserting my rights, protecting my future, and perhaps, in the process, holding Arthur Finch Sr. accountable for his actions in a way that went beyond mere emotional confrontation. My father thought he was dealing with a wayward son he could easily cast aside. He was about to discover he was dealing with a forensic accountant with a vested interest, a deep understanding of complex financial structures, and an unshakable resolve to see justice done. The audit of Arthur Finch Sr. was officially underway. Alistair McPherson, my solicitor, was a man who believed in the power of meticulously prepared paperwork. "Julian," he'd advised, "before we engage directly with your father or his legal counsel regarding the trusts, let's ensure our own house is in perfect order. We need a comprehensive understanding of your current financial position, separate from any anticipated Finch family assets, and a clear picture of what your father could legitimately control versus what is protected." This resonated deeply with my own professional instincts. In forensic accounting, the first step is always to establish a clean baseline, to understand the known variables before delving into the unknown. Over the next few weeks, David and I undertook a thorough review of our joint and personal finances. We had always been prudent, our investments diversified, our spending within our means. But this situation prompted a new level of scrutiny. We consolidated accounts, updated beneficiary designations on our personal policies to further solidify our reciprocal protections, and ensured our own wills and powers of attorney were ironclad, explicitly naming each other and deliberately excluding any potential claims from my side of the Finch family should the unthinkable happen to me. It was a grim task, planning for worst-case scenarios, but a necessary one. My father's actions had demonstrated that familial bonds could be weaponized, and I needed to ensure David was shielded from any such fallout. Simultaneously, Alistair began the formal process of requesting full transparency and accounting from the trustees of my grandfather's various instruments, a group that included my father, my Uncle Robert, who was generally a reasonable man, but often cowed by my father's bluster, and a representative from a long-standing family law firm. The initial responses were, as expected, slow and somewhat evasive. My father, through his own solicitor, a rather pompous man named Bartholomew Hayes, initially tried to stonewall, claiming the request was premature and unwarranted. Alistair's polite but firm insistence on the legal rights of a beneficiary to full disclosure eventually prompted a grudging compliance. The documents, when they finally began to arrive, were voluminous, a testament to my grandfather's complex but ultimately well-intentioned estate planning. I spent several late nights in my study, the familiar glow of my monitor reflecting in my glasses, a large mug of black coffee at my elbow, doing what I do best, sifting through data, identifying patterns, looking for anomalies. David would often find me there in the early hours, a silent, supportive presence, sometimes just placing a fresh cup of coffee beside me before heading to bed. It was during one of these late-night sessions, deep within the labyrinthine clauses of a subtrust related to a commercial property portfolio my grandfather had established, that I found it. An anomaly. A series of transactions over the past 5 years that didn't quite add up. Large sums, designated as management fees and capital improvement expenditures, were being paid out to a holding company I didn't recognize, ARF Enterprises. ARF. Arthur Robert Finch. My father's initials. My forensic accountant's instincts went on high alert. These fees seemed disproportionately large for the nature of the properties involved, and the capital improvements lacked detailed invoicing or verifiable project descriptions. It was sloppy, almost amateurish if one knew where to look. But to a casual observer, or to co-trustees not inclined to dig too deeply, it might have passed as legitimate business expenses. I began to cross-reference these payments with other Finch family business records I had access to from my brief, long-ago stint working for my father. ARF Enterprises, it turned out, was a shell corporation my father had set up years ago, ostensibly for consulting services. It had minimal overhead, no actual employees beyond a registered agent, and its primary purpose, I now suspected, was to serve as a vehicle for siphoning funds from the family trusts and other business entities, under the guise of legitimate expenses. The sums involved weren't enough to bankrupt the trusts, not by a long shot, but they represented a significant and consistent drain, a diversion of funds that should have been accumulating for the beneficiaries, myself, my siblings, and my cousins. And it was a clear breach of his fiduciary duty as a trustee. He wasn't just a prejudiced father. He was potentially a fraudulent trustee. This discovery shifted the entire dynamic. My initial goal had been defensive, to protect my own inheritance, to assert my rights. Now, I had stumbled upon something that had far broader implications, something that could potentially expose my father to serious legal and financial repercussions, far beyond the emotional fallout of our family feud. I immediately contacted Alistair. "I think I found something, Alistair," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral over the phone, though my heart was pounding. "Something significant in the trust accountings for the property portfolio." I arranged to meet him the next day, bringing my meticulously compiled analysis of the ARF Enterprises transactions. Alistair reviewed my findings, his expression growing increasingly grave. "Julian," he said after a long silence, "if your analysis is correct and your documentation here is, as usual, impeccable, then your father has not only breached his fiduciary duty in a most egregious manner, but is also potentially engaged in tax evasion and fraud." He leaned forward. "This is no longer just about your disinheritance. This is about the integrity of the entire Finch family financial structure and your father's potential criminal liability." The implications were staggering. This wasn't a weapon I had sought, but it had fallen into my hands nonetheless. The question was how to use it. A direct accusation, a public expose, would create a catastrophic implosion, damaging not just my father, but potentially my mother, my siblings, and other innocent family members caught in the blast radius. That was not my objective. My objective was justice, yes, but also a strategic resolution that would secure my own future and perhaps, just perhaps, force my father to confront the consequences of his actions without destroying everyone else in the process. "What are our options, Alistair?" I asked. "Several," he replied. "We can report this directly to the authorities. We can use it as leverage in a private settlement negotiation regarding your inheritance and a formal apology for his public statements. Or we can present this information to the other trustees, your Uncle Robert and the legal firm, and demand your father's immediate removal as a trustee and a full independent audit of all Finch family holdings." This last option appealed to me. It was less about personal retribution and more about systemic correction, about restoring integrity to the structures my grandfather had so carefully built. It would also, undoubtedly, create a significant crisis for my father, forcing him to account for his actions to his own brother and his long-standing legal counsel. The power dynamic had just shifted decisively. Arthur Finch Sr., who believed he held all the cards, was about to discover that one of the players he'd contemptuously dismissed from the table was, in fact, holding a royal flush and had just called his bluff. The next step was to prepare a formal presentation of these findings, a dossier of evidence that would be irrefutable. The meticulous archivist in me, the forensic accountant, was now fully engaged. This was no longer just a family dispute. It was a complex case of financial malfeasance, and I was uniquely positioned to bring it to light. The decision to confront my father, not with emotional appeals, but with cold, hard evidence of his financial impropriety, was a significant turning point. It moved the conflict from the realm of personal grievance into the dispassionate arena of legal and fiduciary responsibility, a terrain where I held a distinct advantage. Alistair McPherson and I spent the next week preparing a comprehensive dossier. It included my grandfather's original trust documents, the detailed accounting records I had obtained, my forensic analysis of the ARF Enterprises transactions, and a clear summary of the potential legal and financial ramifications for my father if these matters were made public or brought before court. We also drafted a formal letter to the co-trustees, my Uncle Robert and the senior partner at the family law firm, outlining our findings and requesting an urgent meeting to discuss the immediate removal of Arthur Finch Sr. as a trustee and the appointment of an independent auditor. Alistair advised a two-pronged approach. First, a private meeting with my father, offering him an opportunity to address the situation discreetly, to make amends, and to agree to a fair settlement regarding my inheritance and a public retraction of his statements, in exchange for our commitment not to pursue the fraud allegations more broadly at that immediate juncture, provided he cooperated fully. If he refused or continued his hostile stance, then Phase 2 would be the formal presentation of the dossier to the co-trustees and, if necessary, to the relevant authorities. Give him a chance to salvage some dignity, Julian, Alistair had said, however undeserving he may seem. A cornered man can be unpredictable. A man offered a narrow path to a less catastrophic outcome might just take it. I agreed, though my faith in my father's capacity for reason or remorse was minimal. The meeting was arranged through our respective solicitors. My father, likely expecting a discussion about my unreasonable demands for my inheritance, agreed to meet at his lawyer Bartholomew Hayes's office. David, ever my steadfast ally, insisted on accompanying me, not to speak, but as a silent show of support. The atmosphere in Hayes's opulent, wood-paneled conference room was thick with unspoken animosity. My father sat at one end of the long mahogany table, flanked by Hayes, his expression a mixture of arrogance and impatience. I sat at the other with Alistair and David. Alistair began, his voice calm and measured, outlining the purpose of the meeting, to discuss serious irregularities uncovered in the administration of the Finch family trusts. Hayes immediately bristled. Irregularities? I assure you, Mr. McPherson, my client's administration of his family's affairs has always been impeccable. This sounds like a baseless accusation, a tactic to exert undue pressure in what is essentially a straightforward matter of testamentary discretion. With all due respect, Mr. Hayes, Alistair replied, his tone still even. The evidence suggests otherwise. Perhaps your client would care to explain the nature and purpose of ARF Enterprises and the substantial management fees and capital improvement payments it has received from the trusts over the past 5 years. My father's face, which had been set in a mask of disdain, flickered, a subtle tightening around his eyes, a slight shift in his posture. He knew what ARF Enterprises was. He just hadn't expected anyone else to. Hayes looked at my father, a questioning glance. My father waved a dismissive hand. ARF Enterprises provides essential consulting and oversight services to the trust properties. All perfectly legitimate, all properly documented. Indeed, Alistair said, sliding a copy of our dossier across the table. Then perhaps you can explain these documents, Mr. Finch. They detail over $2 million in payments to ARF Enterprises, a company with no discernible employees, no physical office beyond a P.O. box, and no verifiable record of services rendered, apart from invoices generated by yourself, it would appear. Bartholomew Hayes picked up the dossier, his eyes widening as he began to flip through the meticulously organized pages, the spreadsheets, the copies of bank transfers, the corporate registration documents for ARF Enterprises listing Arthur Finch Sr. as the sole director and shareholder. My father's face had gone from ruddy confidence to a pale, mottled gray. He stared at the dossier as if it were a venomous snake. This is an outrage," he blustered, his voice lacking its usual conviction. "This is a private family matter. You have no right to pry into my business affairs." As a beneficiary of these trusts, Mr. Finch, I spoke for the first time, my voice quiet but firm. I have every right to ensure they are being administered legally and ethically. And as a trustee, you have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interests of all beneficiaries, not just yourself. These transactions, Father, appear to be a clear breach of that duty. The word father hung in the air, a stark reminder of the personal betrayal that underpinned this financial one. Hayes, looking increasingly uncomfortable, cleared his throat. My client assures me that all these transactions are above board. There may be some misunderstandings, some complexities in the way these family holdings are managed. There is no complexity here, Mr. Hayes, Alastair interjected smoothly. There is only a clear pattern of diversion of funds. Funds that rightfully belong to the beneficiaries of these trusts, including my client, Mr. Julian Finch, whom your client has recently seen fit to publicly disown and attempt to disinherit. My father slammed his fist on the table, a flash of his old arrogance returning. He is no son of mine. He has disgraced this family with his lifestyle. He deserves nothing. Your personal feelings regarding my client's private life, Mr. Finch, Alastair said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly, are, with all due respect, irrelevant to your legal obligations as a trustee. What is relevant is this evidence of financial malfeasance. Evidence which, I might add, we are prepared to present to your co-trustees, your brother Robert and Mr. Abernathy from Pringle, Davies & Abernathy, along with a demand for your immediate removal and a full, independent forensic audit of all Finch family entities. And, should that prove necessary, we are also prepared to share this information with the Internal Revenue Service and the relevant state authorities. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but potent. Criminal charges, public disgrace, the dismantling of the Finch family reputation he held so dear. Bartholomew Hayes looked as if he were about to be physically ill. My father stared at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fury, disbelief, and something I hadn't seen there before, a flicker of fear. He had built his life on an edifice of control, of patriarchal authority, of financial power. And in one quiet, meticulously prepared presentation, I had just shown him that his foundations were built on sand, and that the sun he had tried to cast out held the geological survey that could bring the whole thing crashing down. The power dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. The audit was no longer just of his finances. It was of his entire life, his integrity, his legacy. And the chief auditor was the son he had so grievously underestimated. The silence that followed Alastair McPherson's calm but devastating pronouncement stretched for what felt like an eternity. My father, Arthur Finch Sr., seemed to deflate before my eyes, the bluster and arrogance draining away to reveal an older, suddenly more vulnerable man. Bartholomew Hayes, his solicitor, was frantically whispering in his ear, his face a mask of urgent concern. David, beside me, remained a silent pillar of support, his presence a quiet affirmation. Finally, Hayes cleared his throat, his voice strained. Mr. McPherson, Mr. Finch, Julian, perhaps there is room for a more constructive dialogue. My client, Mr. Arthur Finch, has always had the best interests of his family at heart. There may have been administrative oversights in the complex management of these legacy trusts. Nothing intentionally untoward. It was a weak attempt at damage control, a flimsy narrative in the face of overwhelming evidence. Alastair simply raised an eyebrow. Administrative oversights that resulted in over $2 million being diverted to a personal shell corporation. Mr. Hayes? That is a rather charitable interpretation. However, my client, Mr. Julian Finch, is not, at this moment, seeking punitive action. He is seeking justice, fairness, and a secure resolution to the untenable situation his father has created. I spoke then, my voice steady, addressing my father directly, though he still avoided my gaze. What I want, Father, is threefold. First, a full and immediate restoration of any funds improperly diverted from the trusts, with interest to be verified by an independent auditor agreed upon by all parties. Second, your immediate resignation as a trustee from all family trusts where I am a beneficiary, to be replaced by a professional, independent fiduciary. And third, I paused, taking a steadying breath, a public retraction and apology for your statement at the family reunion, to be delivered to all family members who were present, acknowledging that your personal prejudices have no bearing on my worth as a human being or my standing as a member of this family, and certainly not on my rights as a beneficiary to our grandfather's legacy. My father finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and wounded pride. You would demand a public apology? From your own father? You publicly shamed me, Father, I replied, my voice devoid of anger, filled only with a quiet conviction. A public acknowledgement of that error is the only appropriate remedy. It's not about shaming you. It's about restoring a measure of dignity and truth to a situation you created. Hayes interjected quickly. These are significant demands, Julian. My client will need time to consider them. He has 48 hours, Alastair stated firmly. After which, if we do not have a signed agreement in principle to these terms, the dossier we have presented today will be delivered to Mr. Robert Finch and Mr. Abernathy, with a recommendation for immediate legal action. And we will, of course, reserve the right to pursue all other available remedies, including reporting these financial irregularities to the relevant authorities. The ultimatum hung in the air. My father looked from me to Alastair, then to his own increasingly agitated solicitor. The carefully constructed world he had inhabited, one where his word was law and his actions unquestioned, was crumbling around him. He had underestimated not only my resolve, but also the robust legal and financial framework my grandfather had put in place, and, most crucially, his own vulnerability due to his reckless greed. We left Hayes's office in silence. As we walked to the car, David squeezed my shoulder. You did it, Julian. You stood your ground. You spoke your truth. I nodded, a wave of exhaustion washing over me. It wasn't a feeling of triumph, but of a grim, necessary task completed. The next 24 hours were tense. There were a flurry of calls between solicitors. Hayes, clearly under pressure from my father to find a way out, attempted to negotiate to water down the terms. He suggested a private apology, a partial repayment, a phased resignation as trustee. Alastair was unyielding. The terms are not negotiable, Mr. Hayes. Full compliance, or we proceed as outlined. Late the following afternoon, just as the 48-hour deadline approached, Alastair called. We have an agreement, Julian. Signed. Your father has conceded on all points. A wave of complex emotions washed over me. Relief, certainly, but also a profound sadness. This was not how I had ever envisioned my relationship with my father playing out. There was no joy in this victory, only the somber acknowledgement of a deeply fractured bond, perhaps irrevocably broken, but now, at least, clearly defined by truth and accountability. The independent audit, which commenced shortly thereafter, confirmed my findings regarding ARF Enterprises and, in fact, uncovered several other, smaller instances of financial mismanagement on my father's part, further solidifying the necessity of his removal as trustee. He repaid the diverted funds, his personal wealth significantly diminished by the act. His resignation as trustee was swift and unceremonious. The public apology was the most difficult part, for him, I imagine. It came in the form of a carefully worded letter, drafted by lawyers but signed by him, circulated to all family members who had attended the reunion. It acknowledged his inappropriate and hurtful public comments regarding me, stated that his personal views did not reflect my standing or rights within the family, and offered a formal, if somewhat stilted, apology for the distress his words had caused. It wasn't a heartfelt mea culpa, but it was a public retraction, a formal acknowledgement of his error. It was enough. My mother called me after receiving the letter, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Julian, I hope this can be a new beginning. For all of us." I was less sanguine about a new beginning with my father, but I appreciated her hope. My relationships with my siblings also shifted. Charlotte, who had initially urged me to appease my father, was now somewhat awestruck by the outcome. Her respect for me clearly, if grudgingly, increased. Michael's support remained unwavering, our bond strengthened by the ordeal. The Finch family narrative had been irrevocably altered. The unquestioned patriarchal authority had been challenged and, in a significant way, dismantled. The decorative facade of perfect familial harmony had been stripped away, revealing the more complex and sometimes uncomfortable truths beneath. It was, in its own way, a structural remediation of the highest order. The foundations were now, perhaps, a little more exposed, but they were also undeniably more honest. The months following the settlement were a period of quiet readjustment. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake a landscape that was altered yet, in many ways, clearer. My father, stripped of his trustee role and a significant portion of the wealth he had improperly diverted, became a more subdued figure within the family. His pronouncements were less frequent, his arrogance tempered by the undeniable reality of his public climb down and the ongoing scrutiny of the independent fiduciaries now managing the family trusts. He never spoke to me directly about the events, and our interactions at the few unavoidable family gatherings were polite, distant, and entirely superficial. The heartfelt reconciliation my mother had hoped for did not materialize, nor did I expect it to. Some fractures, particularly those in the foundational bedrock of a relationship, are too deep to fully mend. What emerged instead was a kind of truce, an unspoken acknowledgement of new boundaries and a permanently altered power dynamic. My primary focus, however, was not on my father, but on my own life, on rebuilding and reinforcing the structures that truly mattered to me. David and I found our relationship deepened by the shared ordeal. His unwavering support, his calm presence during the most stressful moments, had been an anchor. We began planning a trip we'd long talked about, a walking tour of the Scottish Highlands, a landscape as rugged and resilient as I felt I had become. Professionally, the experience had an unexpected effect. While I had always been respected for my meticulousness and analytical skill, the quiet determination I had shown in handling my personal crisis seemed to earn me a new level of regard among my partners at the firm. It was as if they saw, in a new light, the steel beneath the quiet exterior. I was assigned to several high-stakes, complex forensic cases, situations requiring not just technical expertise, but also a capacity for navigating intense interpersonal and corporate politics. I found I excelled at it. The skills honed in dismantling my father's deceptions proved remarkably transferable to uncovering corporate fraud. The family trusts, now under independent management, began to operate with a new transparency and efficiency. My uncle Robert, freed from my father's overbearing influence, stepped up as a more engaged and responsible co-trustee, working closely with the professional fiduciaries. The first distributions made under the new management were fair, equitable, and fully accounted for, a stark contrast to the opaque dealings of the past. It was a quiet vindication, not just for me, but for my grandfather's original intentions. One afternoon, Alistair McPherson called. "Julian, I thought you might be interested. Bartholomew Hayes is no longer practicing law. Apparently, the fallout from his less than stellar representation of your father, combined with a few other questionable cases, led to a rather pointed review by the Bar Association. He opted for an early retirement. Another piece of the old, compromise structure quietly dismantled. I didn't feel triumph, just a sense of a system, however slowly, correcting itself. I also made a conscious decision to reinvest a portion of my now secure inheritance into causes I believed in, particularly organizations supporting LGBTQ+ youth who had been rejected by their families. My father's prejudice had inflicted a deep wound, but I was determined to transform that pain into something positive, to help build support structures for others facing similar intolerance. It was a way of re-engineering the narrative, of ensuring that the legacy of that hurtful pronouncement at the barbecue was not one of victimhood, but of resilience and constructive action. My mother, Eleanor, slowly began to find her own voice, her own strength in the aftermath. Freed from the constant need to mediate or appease my father, she started pursuing her own interests, rejoining a book club, taking art classes she'd long postponed. Our relationship deepened. We could finally talk openly, without the shadow of my father's disapproval looming over every conversation. She never fully reconciled with his actions, but she found a way to coexist, to carve out her own space within the fractured family dynamic. Charlotte, my sister, remained somewhat distant, her loyalties still subtly aligned with the old patriarchal order, or perhaps simply with the path of least resistance. But even she, on occasion, would call for advice, a tacit acknowledgement of my newfound standing, my proven competence. Michael, my brother, remained my staunchest familial ally, our bond forged even stronger in the crucible of this shared fight for fairness. The final act of this particular family drama came not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost anticlimactic whimper. About 2 years after the settlement, my father suffered a significant health setback, a minor stroke that, while not debilitating, clearly shook him. During his recovery, he was uncharacteristically quiet, reflective. One afternoon, while I was visiting him in the hospital, a visit prompted more by duty and my mother's urging than any deep filial affection. He looked at me, his eyes clearer, less clouded by arrogance than I had seen them in years. "Julian," he said, his voice raspy, "that business with the trusts, I was wrong." It wasn't a full apology, not in the way the letter had been, but it was an admission, a crack in the wall of his pride. "I understand, Father," I said simply. There was nothing more to add. The audit was complete. The accounts were, in their own way, finally balanced. My life, once defined by the subtle and not-so-subtle pressures of his expectations, was now entirely my own, built on foundations of my own choosing, designed to my own specifications. And it was a structure I knew, with the certainty of an engineer who has triple-checked his calculations, would stand firm, no matter what storms might come. The true measure of strength, I had learned, was not in the ability to dominate, but in the quiet, unyielding power to endure, to analyze, and to rebuild with integrity. The years that followed were marked by a quiet settling, like dust after a controlled demolition. The dramatic upheavals within the Finch family gave way to a new, more honest, if somewhat fractured, equilibrium. My father, after his health scare, never fully regained his former blustering authority. He became a more peripheral figure, his influence diminished, his pronouncements carrying less weight. He continued to live comfortably, but the sting of his financial and reputational losses, and perhaps the dawning awareness of his own flawed judgment, seemed to have permanently altered him. He treated me with a distant, wary respect, the kind one affords a former adversary who has proven unexpectedly formidable. It wasn't warmth, but it was a significant improvement over overt disdain. My own life flourished. My career as a forensic accountant reached new heights. The reputation I had inadvertently gained for handling complex, sensitive situations with both discretion and unyielding determination led to more challenging and rewarding engagements. David and I traveled extensively, indulging our shared passions for history, art, and experiencing different cultures. We built a life rich in shared experiences and mutual support, a testament to the fact that family is not solely defined by blood, but by love, respect, and unwavering loyalty. The organizations I supported, those helping LGBTQ+ youth, became a significant part of my life. I joined the board of one, lending my financial acumen to their efforts, finding a deep sense of purpose in helping to create the safety nets and support systems that so many, including a younger version of myself, had desperately needed. It was a way of transforming a personal wound into a source of strength for others, a quiet act of defiance against the prejudice I had faced. My mother found a surprising late-life independence. With my father's dominance curtailed, she blossomed, pursuing her own interests with a gentle but firm resolve. Our conversations became more open, more authentic, and I discovered a woman of quiet wisdom and resilience I hadn't fully appreciated before. She never overtly criticized my father to me, but her quiet support for my actions, her relief at the new transparency in family affairs, spoke volumes. Uncle Robert, now the de facto elder statesman of the Finch Trusts, often consulted me on financial matters, a development that would have been unthinkable in years past. He'd joke, "Julian, thank God your grandfather had the foresight to make you a numbers man. You're the only one who can make sense of his convoluted genius and keep the rest of us honest." The family reunions continued, though they were different now. More subdued, perhaps, but also less performative. The elephant in the room, my father's past actions and my own quiet revolution, was rarely addressed directly, but its presence had subtly reshaped the landscape. I attended, not out of obligation, but out of a sense of quiet ownership of my place in the family, a place I had reclaimed not by conforming, but by asserting my truth. I no longer sought anyone's approval. My worth was not contingent on their acceptance. It was inherent, built on my own integrity, my own achievements, my own capacity for love and loyalty. One day, clearing out some old files, I came across a photograph from that fateful barbecue, taken just before my father's pronouncement. I looked at my younger self in the picture, a man trying to fit in, trying to be accepted, still subtly flinching from the anticipated disapproval. And I compared him to the man I had become, confident, secure, at peace with who I was, beholden to no one's narrow definitions. The transformation had been profound, forged in the crucible of betrayal and a fight for self-respect. The greatest lesson I had learned was that true strength isn't about loud declarations or an iron will imposed on others. It's about the quiet resilience of the human spirit, the meticulous work of building a life of integrity, and the courage to conduct a thorough, unflinching audit of one's own heart and the structures that surround it. My father had tried to cast me out, to erase me from the family ledger. Instead, he had inadvertently initiated a full forensic review, one that had not only secured my own position, but had also brought a necessary, if painful, accountability to the entire system. The decorative facades might still exist in the wider world, but I knew, with the unshakable certainty of an engineer who trusts his calculations, that my own foundations were sound, built on truth, and designed to last. And that, in the final analysis, was the only audit that truly mattered. My life was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most profound acts of self-creation arise from the ashes of what others try to destroy. The final quiet chapter of this particular family saga unfolded, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with a simple, almost mundane act of archival closure. Several years after my father's health decline and the subsequent restructuring of the family trusts, I received a call from the solicitor now handling his personal estate. My father had passed away peacefully in his sleep. The news was met not with grief in the traditional sense, but with a complex mixture of emotions, a sense of an era ending, a touch of sadness for the relationship that never was, and a quiet acknowledgement of the profound impact he, however unintentionally, had had on shaping the man I had become. His will, as he had threatened years ago, did indeed reflect his attempts to minimize my inheritance from his personal estate. However, due to the robust protections my grandfather had established in the family trusts and the changes wrought by the independent fiduciaries, his power to enact any truly significant financial disinheritance had been largely neutralized long ago. What I did receive, unexpectedly, was a small, sealed envelope passed to me by a solicitor with a note in my father's shaky hand. For Julian, to be opened alone. Inside was not a letter of apology, nor a deathbed confession. It was a single, old photograph. A picture of my grandfather, a younger version of my father, and a small boy, me, around age 7 or 8, standing proudly beside a complex model train set my grandfather had built. We were all smiling, a moment of shared, uncomplicated joy, captured before the weight of expectations and prejudices had begun to cloud our relationships. There was no message, no explanation, but the photograph itself spoke volumes. It was an acknowledgement, perhaps, of a time before, a time of potential, a time when the bonds of family felt simpler, stronger. It was, in its own way, his final, tacit admission of a different kind of loss. I placed the photograph in my own personal archive, a poignant reminder that even the most difficult narratives can contain moments of unexpected grace. My life continued, rich and fulfilling. David and I celebrated our 25th anniversary, surrounded by a chosen family of friends who loved and accepted us for who we were, unconditionally. My work in forensic accounting evolved, and I began to specialize more in unraveling complex family trust disputes, my personal experience lending me a unique and empathetic perspective. I found a certain satisfaction in helping others navigate the treacherous waters of familial financial conflict, armed with the principles of transparency, diligence, and an unshakable commitment to factual accuracy. The Finch family, in its various branches, moved on. The trust continued to be managed professionally, providing a stable legacy for future generations, free from the autocratic control of a single individual. My mother found a quiet contentment in her later years, her relationship with me stronger and more honest than ever before. My siblings and I maintained a cordial, if not deeply intimate, connection. The storm had passed, and the landscape, though changed, had found a new, more sustainable balance. Looking back, I realized that my father's attempt to disown me, to erase me from his narrative, had, in the end, been the catalyst for my own liberation. It had forced me to confront not just his prejudice, but my own need for external validation. It had pushed me to build my own foundations, to define my own worth, to curate my own life with intention and integrity. The greatest strength, I had learned, was not in conforming to someone else's flawed design, but in having the courage to draft your own blueprints, to lay your own bedrock, and to build a structure, both internal and external, that could withstand any pressure, any judgment, any attempt at demolition. My name is Julian Finch. I am a forensic accountant, a partner, a son, a brother, and a man who, against considerable odds, successfully audited his own life and rebuilt it on a foundation of unshakable truth. And that, I can say with complete and utter certainty, is an asset beyond measure, a legacy more valuable than any inheritance. The archives are now closed on that chapter, but the lessons learned remain, meticulously cataloged, readily accessible, and an enduring testament to the quiet power of resilience.